there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be part 2 of our Unbeliever-along, which is a read-along of Stephen R. Donaldson's Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever series, which I'm doing along with a number of other booktubers who I will link to below. The first trilogy in this series was written in the late 70s, and it is a portal fantasy in which a character from the then current day is transported off into this fantasy universe. In the first book, which we discussed last month, there is some pretense that maybe this is all a hallucination and it's not a real fantasy situation, it's just brain injuries kind of situation, because when he originally travels to the world, he thinks he's about to be hit by a car. Book 2 basically dispenses with any idea of there being a question of it being a hallucination, so the main character still thinks that maybe he's dreaming, but because we're given a second point of view character, we see things happen in the fantasy world in which Thomas Covenant is not involved, so it can't be his hallucination. The fact that we still have the character focus on that becomes frustrating, because if it were set up as more of a mystery, I think that would be easier to go along with, although to my personal tastes, I'm glad it's not, because I think it's incredibly difficult to do that kind of story well, but it does make some of the internal commentary with that main character a little bit irritating, just because we have information that he doesn't have about the state of the world. In any case, so a month has passed in the real world, 40 years has passed in the land, and this main character is summoned back by the now grown daughter that was conceived when he raped this teenager in the first book, which is an event that is never actually dealt with well, and even though I'm normally on the side of death of the author and intent is irrelevant, because I've read a lot of Stephen R. Donaldson's gradual interview on his website, I know that he views rape as a metaphor and not as an action, so that is the reason that we're not getting any real commentary on that, because I think in a lot of pulp style fantasy you could have kind of an exploitive lens on that, and it would be presented in a here's some shocking stuff for fun, and I think in a more literary presentation or in a more grimdark style presentation there would be more of a focus on the ugliness of humanity in that, and there isn't any of that, which makes it a little bit weird, especially later in the story. We get bits where Elena, Covenant's daughter, is in love/lust with him, and he's not open to it, but it is kind of a mutual attraction, which is gross, but the grossness is not dealt with through either the exploitive lens, which is obviously not to everyone's taste, obviously, but at least it would have like an awareness of that's what's going on, or with any kind of literary or grimdark lens, which give it something else to look at. So I find that to be an odd choice, but because I think Donaldson is framing all of this as metaphor and nothing else, he doesn't seem to think it needs to be, and which personally I think gives it all kind of an empty weirdness, which is not super satisfying as a reader. Now, luckily, that is not necessarily the center point to most of this. We do have a second character that's brought from the real world into the land, who's called Hyle Troy, which is kind of a ridiculous name, but hey. This is a character who works for the Department of Defense, I think it is, in the real world, and so he becomes a military strategist in this world, and has more classic adventure-y bits. I find the writing in this series to be serviceable, so not great, but not terrible. But in terms of the kind of content that I would like to read in an epic-style fantasy setting, yeah, military stuff, entertaining. I think kind of hilariously, in my video about the first one, I talked about how the Thomas Covenant character being somebody who does morally reprehensible things, and also having Hansen's disease or leprosy in the real world, is playing into a very old and not great cliche in which somebody who is visibly diseased or othered is kind of experiencing moral decay in the same way. The linkage of those is such an old cliche that if you don't do anything with it, which this series does not do anything with it, disability cliches 101 we can call it. Well, we have another disability cliche in this volume with this character of Hyle Troy. In the real world, he's blind. He is semi-cured of his blindness in the land, in which he's given a kind of partial sight that is sometimes better than normal sight. He can see longer distances, but not around himself and not at night, so there's limitations, and that kind of superpowered sight in a blind character is everything from, thousands of years ago, Tiresias the Seer, to, Daredevil the superhero. It's another cliche. Now, it's obviously not a negative cliche in the way that the disease equals moral decay linkage is, you know, unfortunate in a different way, whereas this one, it's not a negative stereotype in the same way, but it is a cliche, and it's not a cliche that's being poked at or done. Nothing interesting is happening with the cliche. Oh, I like this character more, but he is still a cliche. We are still dealing with cliche. Still, I was entertained by most of his plot lines. I mean, spoiler, he's turned into a tree at the end, so, I mean, that's the end of his entertaining plot line. But while it lasts, that part is reasonably entertaining. I was reading some threads on the Stephen R. Donaldson fan forum, Kevin's Watch, which is obviously named after the character in this, High Lord Kevin, who's summoned at the end, which presumably kills Elena at the end, which... spoilers? But whatever. I mean, this is a series in which people have names like Lord Fowl, and then there's this High Lord Kevin, and why? But anyway, I was reading a thread on the Kevin's Watch forum. One thing that I thought was hilarious was, if you think about the way the framework through which people view certain demographic categories, it was very funny. There was a whole discussion thread about whether Heil Troy, about whether you're meant to perceive him as black. And in the gradual interview, Donaldson actually says later that he didn't write him with that in mind, but, you know, whatever, the character is never described physically, aside from saying that he doesn't have eyes. So you can certainly you couldn't read any culture into him, because obviously he works for a US government organization in the real world, but there are no, like, race-based descriptions within it. But people who read this in the early 70s and people who read this around 1990 seem to all either associate him in the 70s ones with Stevie Wonder, or in the people who read it in the early 90s with the character Geordi LaForge from Star Trek The Next Generation. So there was this connection of blind character to whoever the most famous image of a blind person was. In those 2 points in time happened to be black, which meant that people who read them in those periods were slightly more likely to have interpreted the character as having been explicitly described as a black character, whereas other people did not. And mostly assumed he was white, I think, by default. I didn't see anyone assuming he was anything else. But I thought it was funny that there was this whole discussion thread about that, where people were arguing about what was the right way to perceive this character for whom there is no physical description other than the fact that he doesn't have eyes. I thought that was interesting. On an external level, just to think about the way we, as readers, are going to interpret something based on the culture surrounding us at whatever point we're reading it. Yeah, so if you're reading along with this series, or if you've read it before, I'd love to hear your opinions. Especially, I think, if this is something that you absolutely hate or absolutely love. I think you're probably having more fun reading this, because I feel like if you have this great emotion, pro or con, it's probably more entertaining to talk about. Because I feel like this is a series that I would just not bother with if I wasn't doing this read-along, and have basically committed to reading at least 6 of these. I feel like I'm slightly looking forward to getting into the second series more, because I haven't read that before, even though I don't really remember these ones. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.